Welcome to the Move Local podcast. Our mission is to connect the movers and shakers of the Dundas and Hamilton area who pride themselves on growing a healthier and more connected community. We will do this through having conversations around health, education, entrepreneurship, and much more. We want to be part of helping you move confident, move free, and move local. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Move Local podcast, brought to you by The Movement. My name is Dalton, and I'm back with you for another episode. We are keeping it in the health space. On my previous podcast, we had Peter Clark on. He's running Your Health Matters, a company focused on stem cells and getting people on the registry. Today, we're keeping it in the health sphere. I have Dr. Anthony Levinson on the podcast. He's a researcher and physician at McMaster University. And he's really focused on implementing and evaluating e-learning and how we can continue to better develop that type of stuff for consumers like the public and people looking to access medical care. So I'm super excited to dive into that conversation with Anthony today. So how are we doing? Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Dalton.
How's the day been so far? Anything exciting on your journey? I know we were talking before, it's always a busy day, but...
Yeah, and I guess as we were chatting about, juggling a lot of hats as an academic physician researcher. So have different roles within the medical school, always trying to find and develop grants or develop new online learning for different audiences. And then I have my other day job of being a physician. So I work in the area of medical psychiatry. I do consults for patients who are in the Juravinski Hospital on the Hamilton Mountain who have been admitted to the hospital for another medical reason. And so the team and the healthcare teams looking after that patient are asking our team to do a psychiatric consultation for different reasons. So.
Yeah, and it's something that I think, even for myself, I didn't really totally understand, having obviously been to the hospital or know people that have had physicians in the hospital. It's like, you guys are often doing a lot more than just in the hospital and, research and teaching and all the other projects that you do. Is that something that is common in the space, or is it something that, do you have to do that as a physician, or?
So that's very much a choice of academic physicians. And so when you are working in affiliation with a university, you are pretty much doing a bunch of these different roles. So many of us are involved in teaching. So we're teaching medical students or resident physicians who are training to become fully independent practitioners. And then we're also in administrative roles within the medical school or these training programs. And then others will have independent research as well. So it's kind of juggling those four main roles when you're an academic physician.
Is that something that you enjoy doing? I mean, I know you have to do it, and the reason I ask is because, obviously being a business owner, and a lot of people that listen to this podcast are business owners, it's similar where you're juggling the hat of...
You are chief cook and bottle washer.
I'm treating clients here still, but we're also trying to grow the business, and so you're kind of similar trying to do those things. Is that something that brings variety and enjoyment to your day, or would you rather have it more focused on certain things?
It depends on the day, I think. But I would say that most people who are in academic medicine do enjoy that variety. Yeah. So I totally respect my colleagues who say are in the community and they're working 100% clinical medicine. I have always really enjoyed the mix, but it is sometimes a challenge to juggle it, as just for small business owners, it's wouldn't it be nice if I could just focus on this instead of X, Y, and Z. But on balance, it's really stimulating and fun to work with different teams too. So I think depending on the type of medicine or the type of academic work that you do, you may also get to work with teams. And I've been really lucky to work with great teams of healthcare providers and nurses, as well as academic research assistants and others. So.
Yeah, for sure. How did the journey begin into becoming a physician or into the medical field? Is that something like you always wanted to do as like a child, or how did you get there?
No, I like the classic McMaster University medical student. So I was very focused on English literature and philosophy and the arts. And so my first degree was in English lit and philosophy, and then I did my first master's degree in an area called critical theory. Nothing to do with medicine, but there was a part of me that had always been interested in medicine. And while I was doing my master's in critical theory, I kind of the love and interest for medicine and doing something more applied, like when you're doing philosophy and critical theory, it gets very abstract. So I kept trying to think, there's got to be something a little bit more applied that can help people. So kind of did a career change after that first master's, and 30 years later.
Here we are.
Yeah, that's right.
So did the philosophy maybe background influence the draw to like psychiatry specifically? Because like with psychology and philosophy, I'm not well versed in all of this, but there's some type of crossover in that type of idea. Is that fair to say?
I think that is very fair to say, and I think there's also a lot of similarities, or there are important aspects of literature and literary theory and an appreciation for narrative and stories that is part of medicine generally, and maybe part of psychiatry more than some of the other specialties. So I think my interest in literature and philosophy has definitely found a home with both my love of teaching, because I spent a lot of time in various aspects of education, whether it's teaching med students or providing education to patients or families, or the online learning. And I think there are ways in which interest in philosophy, in narrative, kind of influenced my interest in the brain and behavior and psychiatry.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So, obviously, you just reference like 30 years and you've had a career, you moved through your career, and I would imagine like there's different paths that obviously come from that and show themselves. But, moving more into like the e-learning side of things, which is obviously a big part of what you're doing now, like how did you end up there? Because I would imagine when you first got into the space, that probably wasn't really something that was being thought of at the time. Like we've seen a big boom in the internet and education by the internet and apps and all that kind of stuff. So
it was kind of interesting way in which partway through my undergraduate medical degree, I decided to take an extra research year in neurology, psychiatry, a bit of lab neuroscience, so some basic brain research, as well as understanding kind of what was sometimes called clinical neuropsychiatry, this kind of mix of when people might have problems affecting the brain that also caused sort of psychiatric symptoms. And I started to get involved in teaching and curriculum even when I was still in medical school. It was an interest of mine, and that was around the time that technologies like PowerPoint and the use of images in PowerPoint or video clips, like this is 30 years ago now almost. So it was sort of the origins of teaching using multimedia, like videos and images, and some of the content that I was teaching even at that point related to teaching people about brain scans like CT scans or MRI, or some of the patients that we would see that might have abnormal movements, problems with their gait disturbance or movement disorders. And so using images and videos in PowerPoint presentations, which was pretty new at the time, was a really effective way of teaching. And then as I got more involved in sort of the medical school education, there was this challenge around really scarce resources. Like there's just not that many academic teaching physicians, and they're pretty busy teaching patients. So there's often a shortage of like, well, are there ways that we could teach the students sort of more efficiently or more effectively? And, you know, sometimes in the old curriculum at the medical school, you'd do the same presentation for a small group, you know, 3 times. And it was like, there's got to be a better way. So I started getting interested in, is there some potential, you know, sort of marrying this interest in how you use images or videos, but also I was beginning to experiment myself with just like recording voiceovers for PowerPoints and having these materials that could help with the teaching when there was maybe a shortage of people who could do the teaching in some topics.
Yeah, that's interesting. What time frame would have this been like?
So this is like my year that I'm taking the year in med school is like 95, 96, and again these are sort of relatively early days for the use of images and video in PowerPoint, and even when you're starting to create sort of computer-based learning, sometimes the speeds aren't very fast. You know, it's not like there's high-speed broadband internet. So, you know, there's again a very practical approach to how are you going to deliver this? So sometimes you might be burning it onto a CD back in those days, or putting it on a hard drive, or things like that.
So you're kind of ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about how to deliver it that way. And then obviously now for sure the technology has caught up. And it's funny, I had this is kind of side note, but I had this like weird realization the other day when like I was talking with my girlfriend and we're like, oh, like just download this app. And we downloaded the app in like 2 seconds. And it was on my phone. And for some reason I had this thought in my head. I'm like, it's so crazy that we can just like be talking about this, go on, download an app, it's on our phone in 2 seconds.
I often, like I tell my kids, like 93 was when I started at Mac. It was the first year that they had email at McMaster.
Yeah.
And in order to try to manage the accounts, because they had no experience, they made you go to like 3 different buildings to get like a ticket in order to get an account. And of course, it was very slow. It was dial-up, and but there were some interesting, you know, precursors to some of the online learning. Even when I started med school, I remember they used to have something called a slide tape show, and you had faculty members who had created the old style 35 millimeter slides, and they were synchronized with audio cassettes, and it was a similar kind of way of how can you use multimedia, the audio and the slides, to effectively teach some of these concepts. And we also had some really great early teachers who were ahead of their time in terms of teaching conceptual approach to medicine with illustrations and diagrams and things like that. So people were doing work, and I think one of the areas that's interesting about online learning is there are these constraints. Like, constraints now are different from what they were 25 years ago, but there are always constraints around the technologies and how sophisticated, you and your girlfriend, you can download the app in 2 seconds, but when we're designing some of the online learning experiences for older adults or people who might be in rural communities or things, there are these practical considerations around, can't just do these like super high-end augmented reality, get your Apple glasses on kind of thing. You have to
it's like the technology and then the integration of the technology successfully, which is always a totally
and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going at the lowest common denominator of the technology, but you do have to make some practical decisions around it.
It'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about like the research, like how you got into the research and the research that you are doing around the e-learning stuff. Because like that's something like, obviously we talked a little bit about it, which is why we have you on the podcast, but I don't even really know exactly what types of stuff you're looking at, even with regards to that research.
Yeah, and I would say there's a couple of different ways of thinking about the e-learning research. So some of it is around like the nitty-gritty of how do people learn? So if you're going to design online learning, what is the most effective way to do it? Sort of what are the active ingredients? And so there's actually a body of scientific literature that studies these sort of nitty-gritty questions like, should you use audio in an e-learning presentation? Should the user be in control of navigating to the next slide? Or should it play automatically, more like a video? When might you use like images, and should you have like background music? You know, sometimes you go and if you're scanning YouTube, there's instructional videos and they often have like background music. So there's actually a whole science around when to use some of these principles, and they make a pretty big difference in terms of the impact on learning. So some of the earliest research that I got interested in was more of that, like how should we design this, and maybe comparing like a version of teaching brain anatomy where the user could control it versus, you know, one where you can't rotate it, but it's just fed to you, and seeing how people would remember like brain anatomy structures. And we still do that type of research, which is sort of like the cognitive psychology of learning and playing around with different principles. So one of the types of research we do now is called test-enhanced learning, because it's been shown if you quiz people, it's actually a really good way for them to learn material, especially for things like language learning or other things where it might be useful to memorize things. So we're playing around now in some of the medical school curriculum with giving people different variations of quizzes, some where it might be on the same topic, sort of like the questions at the end of the chapter, and others where we might give them mixed practice or questions where they have to come up with the answer versus multiple choice ones where they can see the responses and looking at the impact of learning. So that's one type of research which I would say is more like the science of online learning.
Yeah, that stuff interests me a lot, because like obviously I've consumed a lot of educational content, and the more that you learn about, I've taken an interest in psychology as well, and just like learned a bit, and like why are people reading what they're reading, watching, doing what they're doing. So like I find that to be interesting, and I've learned a little bit about just what are people paying attention to. Like, is it good to have audio and video? Is it good to have background music? Like, so the fact that there's research behind that, I think it makes sense to me that is a thing.
It is, but it's interesting. I think a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of it, and some of the research goes back years ago. And I think a lot of the questions that people would ask me in my role within the medical school was, is online learning as effective as in-person learning? And so there's a whole history of education literature that is sort of referred to as the no significant difference thing. Right. That basically how you design the education is more important than whether it's delivered in person or delivered by computer. But people get really preoccupied with that, and I think until the pandemic,
I was just going to say,
we were sort of ahead of the curve because we were doing quite a lot of like complementing medical education with online learning opportunities for extra practice or to supplement curriculum. But I think there were a lot of programs that were, say, more traditional, where it was like, no, you got to have bums in seats and give lectures and things like that. And there's certain types of content that really lends itself to video. So in physiotherapy, for example, like the ability to show movement, to show somebody doing a clinical examination, to be able to illustrate that with video or really well-designed stills where you're showing exactly. So depending on the topic and what your goals are, there can be a role for different types of education and different design.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then what are some of the other areas? You said there's a couple there.
I think the other areas are just much more kind of practical around understanding the effectiveness of the education itself. So rather than manipulating variables and saying what's the best way to teach something, it's more, is this effective? how effective it is. So some of the research we will do there might be things like pre-post studies where you administer a quiz or a test of ability before the educational intervention, and then afterwards you might follow up with a post test. And depending on how much budget you have for your research, you might even say, well, let's wait a couple weeks and see if somebody still remembers this, or it's great that they improve their knowledge, but did they actually improve their skills, or did it make a difference? So the different types of outcome research, some of it is more around just like, hey, we want to raise awareness, so we want to kind of maximize the number of people that learn about something. Some of it gets at, are people learning? And a lot of that is with, pre-post knowledge questions. And then you get into, okay, is this going to change their behavior? Is this learning going to transfer in such a way that the person's developing skills or their attitudes changed, or it's actually having sort of a longer term outcome effect? So I would say that. So from the basic science of learning kind of work to more randomized controlled trials, or at least like effectiveness research, to knowledge translation or implementation, like how do you implement something to maybe raise awareness amongst the maximum number possible, or hopefully change outcomes, like improve people's self-management, not just their knowledge, but that it has an impact on their day-to-day lives, or it improves the training of the health professionals who then, secondarily it would improve patient care and patient outcomes.
Right. And I think the cool part about what, you're doing with the research, and then obviously with like some of the other things you're doing outside of that, is like it from the outside, from my perspective, it seems like you're trying to then take the research and implement it into like practice. And like, I think like with the McMaster like health portal that you are part of, and like creating programs for that would, from my perspective, be you actually implementing what you're learning in the research and putting it into practice and trying to bridge that gap. And I think sometimes, even just from what we know in the physiotherapy space, is like you have research and then you have practice, and then sometimes
they don't always speak.
They don't always align. They're not speaking. Like there's, I think like we've seen improvements just in general in that, where researchers and practitioners are bridging the gap better, I would say now, and trying to make it, how do we use this research in context of practice, and then practice being like, okay, well,
inform the research. Like, hey, here, let's study something that's important. And so that's very much the case. I think like within, say, the medical school curriculum, we try to study the best ways to do things, or when we are creating e-learning for medical students and residents, it's like, let's try to design this in the way that we have evidence that this is how people learn best, and it's most likely going to transfer. And then for initiatives like trying to improve the health literacy of the general population, or we've done some work on for family care partners, things like that, it's same approach. It's like, okay, we know how to design good online learning experiences, so let's pick topics that are important for people to understand. We had a project to improve people's knowledge about dementia risk factors, so we'll design the e-learning. We'll have other complementary aspects of it, like people will have email reminders to reinforce things they've learned from an e-learning lesson or a multimedia lesson. And so in very much trying to bring the best evidence approach and apply it to projects, no matter who the target audience is.
And what are some of the things that you've seen be like successful, or from the perspective of like integrating e-learning education, and some of the things that you've done? Like the one thing that always comes to my mind is like, are people actually initiating behavior change? Like if you're doing a e-learning module on how sleep is important for reducing, anxiety or whatever it is, it's like, and how effective is that at like initiating behavior change and those things happening? Like, is there things that you're seeing from like the practical standpoint where you're like, oh yeah, this is actually having a lot of success, or like, maybe we could do better in this area to make it more effective?
Yeah, and I think it's also a difficult thing to study sometimes, and there are sometimes other confounding variables because other things influence behavior. So you might have done a
Totally.
great job teaching them, but
Right.
there's other barriers. So I would say, like, here's a recent example. We had this dementiarisk.ca online curriculum, and we did a randomized control trial to better understand the impact of the e-learning on people's knowledge and their attitudes and behaviors and even their activity levels. So we were actually quite pleasantly surprised to see not just an increase in knowledge, which we anticipated because you're teaching somebody something, and no surprise that their knowledge of that thing should improve, although
Right.
it doesn't always. So knowledge improved, but really surprised to see that their physical activity levels also improved, and their intentions to engage in healthy behaviors that have been shown to promote brain health and reduce the risk of dementia also increased. So, it's one like relatively short-ish study, but pretty impactful for a 35-minute educational intervention. And we showed, so after taking that from sort of the more lab type of setting of the randomized trial, we then implemented that on the McMaster Optimal Aging portal. And similarly, we have feedback from people who go through the e-learning saying, this was really relevant to me, I understood it well, I'm going to use it, I think I'm going to benefit, here's my plan to reduce my risk of dementia over the next 3 months. So, it's hopefully we can get added funding to kind of follow up on that and look at longer term outcomes. Do people stick with those plans? Does it have that impact? But pretty encouraging for some of those initial studies.
Yeah, what do you think are some important, and I know that's probably all encompassing, like it's probably an unfair question of like, well, what made that so good? Because it's like the whole presentation itself, the way it's structured, I would imagine, but even just thinking of like some tangible things that you would be important to include in educational type e-content for people, like what would you say are some of those things?
Yeah, that is a tough one, because I think I think a lot of it is context dependent in terms of what are the goals, and I'll talk a bit about like, okay, here are some of the principles that we do know about how to design online learning, but a lot of people will come to me or our team and say, I want to make e-learning, and they'll focus on like the format. I want a punchy 2-minute video, or I've seen those cool whiteboard things. I want to do that. So they're not really focused on actually what is your objective. Is an educational intervention even the thing you should be doing? Like maybe you just need a poster as a reminder,
right.
Or you need, like in medicine we have these standardized order sets, so instead of teaching somebody about what they should order in this case, why don't you just make an order set instead of. So I think a lot of times people come with an idea, but they haven't really formulated what exactly is your objective.
Like, I just want that flashy video.
I want that flashy video. And I think sometimes people point to there's a need for education, but it's actually, it takes more time and effort to create these things.
Yeah.
And I think people often have this sense of, if you build it, they will come, but actually implementing education and then maintaining it, marketing it.
Yeah, it's a whole thing.
It's a whole thing.
It's not easy. Like it gets portrayed as it is when you see something that's like very well done. Yeah. And you're just and a lot of people are consuming it, but like just knowing, like we put together a mentorship for physiotherapists through the movement, an online mentorship where we're just like taking them through modules that we created. Mm-hmm. And like just to create and put that together and market it and try to get people, like it's a whole a whole journey, which is kind of selfishly why I asked the question, because like I like that, like the principle thing is important because like you can apply principles across anything, right?
And I would say sometimes, like when people do come, I say, well, have you looked to see what's out there already? Because curating existing content is a really good approach. Like, you don't always have to reinvent the wheel or make stuff yourself, but actually bringing together, selecting existing high quality resources, and then maybe adding a bit of glue to stick it together. So it's not always the case that you have to start from scratch, but I do find a lot of people, they're like, well, I want to kind of make my own way or whatever, and it does wind up being a lot of work. But things that we know work for e-learning in particular, and it does depend on the context. Sometimes people will say, okay, well, what's your main purpose? Is it to inform, or are you looking for a performance goal? And then, how much is it like a rote performance? Like, there's a procedure here, because maybe you just need a policy or a job aid or something that just like tells you a step-by-step guide. And then, or is it more of a principle, in which case, like, what you might need to design is more like a simulation, right? If you have somebody, you want them to practice a certain type of skill, you might need to design something that's a little more sophisticated and time consuming. But principles that we do know about is that if you can incorporate instructional visuals, like images that are meaningful, that adds significantly to the transfer of learning. So if you've got something like a diagram that is well done, and you just compared that to teaching somebody with words alone, you're going to improve somebody's learning substantially if you're including those visuals. People's brains function mostly with what we call the dual channel hypothesis. We're looking at visuals, we're seeing words that might be, say, on a screen, we're listening, and so if you can capitalize on visuals and verbal, then and use those two together effectively, that maximizes learning. But people also have kind of limits in terms of what their brains can process. We call it cognitive load. So other principles around cognitive load are, you want to maximize how much attention somebody can bring to the learning and minimize distractions. So I think sometimes people design, flashy videos with background music. The background music alone can actually hamper learning. So people sometimes think, well, we gotta get people interested and keep them aroused and engaged by having all these bells and whistles, but sometimes that's actually going to interfere with the learning goals. So that's another important one, is just trying to minimize distractions. But like if you were doing a face-to-face session and you were pumping heat in, or there was noise next door, people can't focus or concentrate. It's kind of the same with e-learning. If you distract
you gotta be careful
people,
with all the flashy stuff.
Absolutely, and most of the time, you see PowerPoints that have all these cool transitions or clip art or things like that. Those are probably interfering with learning, and I think people they're like, oh, I better put in a cartoon to
spice it up.
But that probably does more harm than good. And there's about 10 of these different principles that have been pretty well studied for online learning.
I mean, I'd personally like to read more about those. I think that'd be cool. But the thing that I've taken away is, like, there's so much nuance to it. Like, there's so much more nuance to it than we really think, which is, I think, just important in general to know, right? And like, there's a lot of thought that goes into putting something like that together that's intentionally done. And I think when it's done really well, you don't even realize some of these things as how intentional they are, where it's like you probably really notice something that is very bad.
And I think when I feel like it's interesting, like the pandemic also, I think, shone a bit of a light on, oh, look at the power of these technologies. People were signing up for webinars, but they also highlight, just because you can make something and you can distribute it doesn't mean that it's going to be of a high quality. So we sometimes, a lot of corporate training, probably many of the listeners have had to sit through some kind of health and safety compliance training. Often those types of mandated compliance trainings are what we call shovelware. Somebody's just taken text or a manual. They've put it into a format where you have to go through and click through all the screens, but it's actually not well designed for how people learn. And
which is why people are just like...
Yeah, and even for webinars, it's like if you take a very bad lecture and you put it in a webinar format where it's just this sort of didactic thing.
Well, which is like, we've all been on those. Like,
I mean, it's not effective if you're in an auditorium listening to it, and it's less effective when you have all these other distractions. But there's ways to create engaging webinars, and I think people now are more attuned to this idea of like the flipped webinar, where you might do a bit of reading beforehand and then there's audience response systems or polling or visuals or case studies that are done, during the webinar time. And so,
what is like the main driver of this for you? Like, why is this so important to you personally?
I find it really interesting and satisfying. Like, I think it is interesting to be able to design and build these effective educational presentations. So I think going back to like the earliest days of, what I described in terms of, well, how do we build these and build them well and have that impact and be able to, like, the scale of it, right? That you can build this e-learning and anybody can access it at any time, and that it can have this like beneficial impact in terms of people learning about their health or about a condition that their loved one has. So to me, it's like a really well designed educational experience like that is quite impactful, and when you do it online, it has the potential to scale. I think there's something very creative about it, and as I was saying, I enjoy working with a team, and I've been really fortunate to work with a team of creative people and programmers and designers, and so it's really fun. You can do good stuff on your own, and I don't mean, like, we haven't talked about the challenges of like limits on budget and schedules, and so I think there's some excellent short presentations and podcasts and videos. Like, not everything has to be this big multimedia production, but it's fun when you can pull together a team and like the whole is better than the sum of its parts.
Totally.
So I think really high quality e-learning is a team sport, and it's creative and it's fun to work with other people.
Yeah, it's cool. It's a cool way to use your knowledge as a physician, and like I think it's a good way to develop with like where the world is going in terms of like consuming content and learning. And I think it's important that we develop these things, especially in healthcare, where like we know that there's a challenge with scale, and that's what really motivates me a lot to like it always has motivated me with like putting out content. Like we did it through Instagram and we've done podcasts, but like, and we continue to do that. And the biggest driver for that for me is like similar to what you're saying, is like you can really have impact on people at scale by providing high quality information. And I think you as healthcare professionals, like if we can continue to get more well versed in that space and develop those things and impact more people, it's only going to have a positive outcome.
I think we've seen that. We started doing a series of webinars for the public through the McMaster Alumni Association and the Optimal Aging Portal, and I think access to specialists is quite challenging at the moment. So people are really starved for high quality, credible information about various health conditions, and one of our other initiatives around care partner education in dementia called iGeriCare. My colleague Richard Stramko is a geriatrician. It was like we both enjoy being able to spend time with patients and their families and explain things, but even in psychiatry and geriatrics, where we tend to spend a lot more time with patients and families than other specialties, it's still like we never have enough time to explain all the things we would want to do. So we tried to capture with our iGeriCare platform, a series of 12 e-learning lessons where it's like, hey, if we had time to explain to you,
this is
how we do it, and we design it with visuals and like that, and that's been super impactful for people as well.
And I think people are more in tune and craving that type of information and more willing to want to learn it. Like, and I think we're just providing that information is important and letting the public decide whether or not they want to consume it. Like, I think it's our job as healthcare professionals to try to deliver it in a way that's consumable, and taking, like, you know, some of the medical jargon that like you and I could talk about and disseminating it into a way that the public can consume it. Like, I do think that's something that's very important for us to do as healthcare professionals.
Yeah, I think there's also obviously a challenge now. Like, on the one hand, there may be challenges in terms of access to high quality, credible information, but it's not like there's a shortage of information. It's just sorting out.
It's like learning how to evaluate that
evidence. So, you know, with the portal and some of our other like online properties, it's really trying to take the best evidence that's out there, but communicate it in a format that makes sense to people. But, you know, there's a lot of competing information sources out there, and I think it is hard for people to evaluate that.
And my take on that has always been like, well, then we need to continue to do a good job of putting out high quality information, right? Like, because no matter what, there's always going to be bad information that goes out, and those people, you're always going to be competing with that. And I think that at first, when I first started talking about content and putting stuff out, like with even some of my older professors, that was like the first rebuttal was like, well, you know, like there's all kinds of bad information out there, and it's like, well, yeah, then we need to put out the good information, and we need to try and compete with that and communicate people like, hey, this is what you need to do, because like that bad information is going to go out regardless of whether you and I like it or not.
And I think sometimes it's not even necessarily like bad information or misinformation. I think the media is still really interested in like more sensational types of stories. So they tend to pick up on like, well, here's an exciting breakthrough study, but it's really still at the animal research stage, and so it is exciting and there's nothing wrong about it, but there's just sort of like, hey, that's a pretty big leap to go from this one, you know, animal research finding. It might be a decade before there's, you know, this is in practice or that. So I think people, you know, in the media, they do tend to focus on these sort of big discoveries.
Well, it's going to draw a lot of attention.
Yeah, and unfortunately, most of the healthcare things that people can do now, they're not so exciting.
Super flashy. Oh, like I need to sleep 8 hours. I need to drink more water. I need to eat better.
Be more physically active.
That doesn't. It's not as flashy as like the newest.
That's right. Take a pill instead of exercise.
Before we transition into some like rapid fire questions, like, is there anything that you're super excited about right now in like the research or what you guys are finding? Is there anything?
I have to say I've been very excited about the potential impact of a relatively short online intervention on, you know, perhaps changing people's behavior intentions, getting them to become more physically active. And so I'm excited about our continuing to raise awareness around how people can promote brain health, and we'll probably look at taking that in, you know, with different audiences, maybe help younger people to understand more of the brain health promotion, even as I think older adults are interested in, you know, preventing dementia.
Right.
We'll probably do some other studies with people who have cognitive impairment, and we're about to do some research around improving the public's understanding about depression and anxiety, sort of what's sometimes called health literacy or mental health literacy, because I think there's still a lot of gaps in people's knowledge there.
That's huge.
So hopefully improve knowledge, reduce stigma. So we've got some work there. Within the medical school, we are doing a bit more research in terms of ways with that artificial intelligence and some of these AI tools like ChatGPT can help in the design of practice problems, and because it's quite a lot of work to say even design like practice questions with feedback to enhance the students' learning experience. And they're always saying, oh, we want more practice questions. So we've been doing some early research work to investigate the accuracy and ability to use ChatGPT to generate and evaluate student responses, to maybe incorporate sort of the ability to, in conjunction with a faculty member, speed up the creation of some of these things, or even provide more learning opportunities. Again, doing it carefully, making sure there's
that's a whole nother podcast.
That the content is valid.
I would imagine that's where a lot of some research will go, and I'm definitely curious to pick your brain on that at some point about the AI stuff. Okay, a couple of rapid fire questions that I like to ask everyone is like, what would be one of your favorite local restaurants here in Hamilton?
So many. Well, we do enjoy Sean and Ed's. Okay. Quatrefoil's pretty unmatched in terms of high-end fancy dining. Love me the Café Domestique as well. So lots of good places. And
I know we've talked about it before, and I'm blanking on the breakfast spot that you like to go to.
Oh, Sammy Joe's. Sammy's up in Ancaster. So that's probably the favorite. But no shortage of good spots. But that'd be the short list, I think.
Yeah, that's fair. What would be like your favorite way to stay active?
Well, I don't have a lot of choice, but I do like walking the dog. Yeah. So there's interesting health literature around, especially older people now that I'm older. But people with different health conditions, one of the things that's been shown to be helpful for them is you either have grandkids or a dog or both. So really, so I like playing sports. So I forced myself to come here for training, but I still enjoy playing tennis or doing other sports as the way to stay active. Yeah.
The last question I like to always ask everyone is like, when you hear the word move local, like what does that mean to you? Like, how would you interpret that?
I see it as kind of a form of community engagement. Like there's obviously the movement aspect, and I think physical activity, exercise is so important. But I do like what you guys are doing in terms of the building the sense of community around that. And I think people to help people to stay like healthy, active, engaged. I think when I hear the move local, it's about keeping people engaged with their community as well, because I think we had enough isolation for a little while, and that continues to be an issue for a lot of people. So I think communities like Dundas, like Ancaster, Hamilton, I think that they're maybe just the right size, right, to keep people engaged and get them to think about getting out and being active and out in their local communities.
Yeah, no, I love it. If there's any place you could leave where people could learn a little bit more about you or the work that your team is doing, like what would be the best place for them to find out what you guys are doing?
We've got a few different properties. I would say if you want to get a feel for some of the health information, evidence-based information for the public, the McMaster Optimal Aging Portal has quite a few. It has a whole
and I was looking through it the other day. It's great. Like,
it's got content in different formats. So like our team has focused on like the e-learning and videos on the site, but there's blog posts, articles,
like the
evidence
content
summaries.
That you get from it is always
all topics related to healthy aging. And then if you're interested in promoting brain health, reducing risk of dementia, you can go to dementiarisk.ca, which is actually our online program on the portal related to dementia risk reduction. But that'll give you a feel for some of the e-learning that we do, and that's probably a good place to start.
I'll leave all those links in the show notes for you guys to access. But Anthony, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot today. I have more questions for you that I'll probably ask you off camera, but thank you for taking the time today to talk with us.
Yeah, anytime. Happy to talk people's ear off about e-learning theory anytime. So awesome. Thanks for having me.
Bye.